So biotech happened and I got right into it. Straight away I'll say I think it's a great expansion that very elegantly works a lot of the basic concepts of some of the more popular mods into the vanilla experience. And I probably don't need to run down the features of the DLC for you, but in case you missed it, the three headliners are player-controlled mechanoids, genetically diverse colonists, and of course alongside that, breeding. It's pretty easy to experience all of these in a single playthrough, which is what I'll be doing here. So I chose the sanguiphage scenario where you start with two colonists. One sanguiphage, which is a vampire by the way, and what I guess is their thrall that they continually promise to turn into a sanguiphage but then never do, like Guillermo in What We Do in the Shadows. So anyway, in this scenario, Nandor is called Sanguinius and is a very general colonist, while Guillermo is called Ralderon, who's good at crafting, mining, plant work, and is a cannibal. That's just how we do things here. The two of them are following the ideology of the Revenant Legion, which is a reference I hope will land. Anyway, it's a pretty powerful ideology combining transhumanism and tunneler to create the ultimate gang of cave-dwelling weirdos. We settled along the spine of the Green Needle Mountains in a boreal forest, sporting an average temperature of 3 degrees C. Nippy. Now, we've got quite a lot to do, and starting with just two colonists, it's going to take a while to kick into gear, so let's not dwell too much on the early game. You've seen me do this before anyway, so I think I'm good to just cover the highlights. Being tunnelers, we burrowed right into the face of the mountain and got the basics set up. A small barracks with a space to eat, a very small prison cell for anyone unfortunate enough to survive the wrath of Sanguinius, a reasonably sized fungus farm, and a large fridge to go along with it. In the initial few raids, Sanguinius demonstrated one of the early game problems with the sanguiphages. They're extraordinarily adept at killing people, which would be helpful if they didn't rely on the hemogen, which apparently only flows through the veins of a living victim. They're no use to us dead. They're so good at killing people, in fact, that when we had a pig person arrive as a refugee, who I thought would make the perfect long-term blood bag for Sanguinius, he killed him in a social fight. Just straight up beat him to death with his fists. Mechanically speaking, this happens because of the xenogene for strong melee damage, which applies a 150% multiplier to their damage, which, again, is a very strong and mostly beneficial trait, except for when it isn't. Like when you're trying to take prisoners to turn into nuggets and milk for hemogen. Anyway, for a change I decided to accept the deserter quest and make enemies of the Empire. For the trouble I got Comnena, Byzantine historian and daughter of the Emperor Alexius Comnenus. Wait, no, that's not her. This Comnena is a nervous psychopath with an annoying voice. Google says it's pronounced Comnini, but I've been saying Comnena in my head this whole playthrough, so that's what I'm sticking with. Something else Sanguinius can do very well is leap. He do be jumping. Jumping right into the windows of unsubscribed viewers last I heard, so, you know, just a suggestion. I did install a few mods by the way, but just basic stuff, nothing really game-changing. I've constantly been annoyed by not being able to see moods at a glance, so I installed the color-coded mood bar mod. And I wanted to make this colony with a very distinct aesthetic, which standing lamps just weren't going to work for, so I installed the good old wall lights mod. And as well as Camera Plus, because I wanted to really get right in there. I don't think I'd ever actually run this mod on my own. I like the standard camera bounds, but for making these videos, it's very good. Anyway, back to the story. Comnena joined and I needed to convert her to our ideology or she'd go mad living in a tunnel and eating paste. But with only 2 followers in the colony, I had to do that by imprisoning her, which means for quite a while we'd be back down to 2 colonists. Comnena isn't alone though. I finally took someone alive from a raid to serve as Sanguinius' personal feed bag. Sanguiphages need to constantly top up their hemogen bar to be able to use their cool and fun abilities. and also to prevent them from being really pissy when it reaches 0. We'll get into some really awful war crimes later on with this, but for now I just keep this person in a cell and feed on them whenever required, which they don't love, but it could be worse. Much worse. A little later on, halfway into winter in fact, we got to see one of Biotech's most anticipated features. Animal people. And we killed them. After which I took a rewarded combat quest which would see a pair of Impid archers attack for 2 masterworks, a revolver and a bed. Both very nice, just in extremely different circumstances. So, if I may draw your attention to 2 of the colony's prisoners here. Sniff and Nerve. Noive? Nerve? Oh, whatever, their names really don't matter. They're the first of the colony's permanent, unwilling residents. Most of you degenerates will already know this, but for the rest of you, in Rimworld you can't just directly remove a prisoner's legs. But you can fit them with wooden stumps, and then remove those, which achieves the same end result. Normally I'd call these flesh nuggets, but given what we're using them for, blood bag feels more appropriate. Nove is occupying this nice room right now, which is kind of insulting considering they couldn't get out of bed if they wanted to. I'll make them rooms more appropriate for their position later. A little while on, we finally re-recruited Comnena after her re-education therapy. And at about the same time we recruited Eustace, who crashed in a transport pod and miraculously didn't die, given that he's a genie. A xenotype essentially engineered to be good at crafting and research at the expense of physical robustness. This trait was demonstrated when we were set upon by a large herd of man-hunting snow hares. And there's a very obvious Monty Python and the Holy Grail joke in here, so here it is. Look, we're even hiding behind the rocks like they are in the scene. Don't worry, he's fine. I should probably remember to keep someone else in front of him though going forwards. Moving on, whilst digging out the space for the temple, named the Font of Blood by the way, very gothic, we discovered this nice little open space, a grotto of sorts, which is a useful space to have as well as looking pretty cool. Speaking of looking cool, these 2 large rooms here are shaped like blood drops. I mean, they don't look like anything else of course, certainly nothing with a flared base designed for rectal insertion. I just wanted to make sure we're all on the same page regarding how they're shaped like blood drops and how that's edgy and dark and gothic. They're not butt plugs. So, moving even further on, one of the future blood bags went berserk, so Sanguinius opened the door, got on the floor, and then everybody did the dinosaur? Wait, no, that's not what happened. Sanguinius just beheaded him, which was awkward, but looking back, they never would have worked as a blood bag anyway. They are, or rather were, a waster, which is the xenotype which requires psychite just to stay alive. So this is getting properly grim, but I think the ideal blood bags are pigskins, because they can eat anything and have a strong immunity gene. But we don't need to talk about this much beyond here. The collection of hemogen farms will grow a little more, but you actually don't really need that many to sustain just a few sanguiphages. And by the way, I didn't mention how a sanguiphage can implant their genes into somebody else once every 2 years. Doing so puts the recipient into a coma for a couple of days and makes the implanter a little bit sleepy, but then they have all the benefits and drawbacks of being a sanguiphage. This effectively creates an exponential spread too, assuming you had infinite colonists, because 2 years later you'll be able to make 2 more sanguiphages and so on and so forth into the fog of time. Now, it's about time I finally went to that compound from the Deserter quest to get those neuroformers. But rather more excitingly, also nestled away in the camp was a Persona Zeus hammer. Its persona isn't great, just kill thirst, but still, that hammer will prove to be extremely useful. A wanderer joined whilst Sanguinius was on the way to that compound, named Stuart. He's a decent all-rounder, but he's a bit old. Still, very welcome, especially for mining. Then Comnena got her lung blown up during a raid of pig people, which was annoying, and I didn't want to start harvesting from the blood bags, so I sort of just committed to having her live with a single lung until I could make or buy one of the new detoxifier lungs that were added in biotech. The hole in the ground continued to transform from a cave into a sanctum, with a grow room taking shape lit in UV purple, and shortly after, extremely atmospheric red lighting started to go into the hallways as well. Smoothing this many walls takes a really long time, but it was starting to get done bit by bit. And thanks to having the hydroponics of course, it was also time to start painting. The hallways look really good in red. I really love this feature more than I can explain. And speaking of features, Comnena is pregnant, so I'm going to get to experience that one next. Not a whole lot happened during her pregnancy. There was a mech cluster, a very easy one to be honest, and then there was a fairly large raid of those Tox folk, which made me realise I should probably build some kind of defensive structure, because standing out here in a field of rocks isn't going to just work forever. And with the baby coming, I made a little hospital and put some baby stuff in their bedroom. However, despite doing pretty much everything I could, the baby came out sick, which is annoying, but ultimately fine so long as it's treated. In honour of her current state, I named the baby Sicko. I didn't talk about death resting yet, did I? Well, it's another thing that sanguiphages do. They have to spend a few days asleep every once in a while. It comes with some bonuses provided you build various machines near their casket. And they have a limit to how many of those machines they can utilise, but that can be raised with an item that's only attainable through quest rewards or trading. Anyway, I'm bringing it up now because what usually happens is you put your big strong vampire edgelord away for his mandatory nap and then a hostile event happens. This time it was an infestation in this new chamber I had excavated out here for future use. In Sanguinius's absence, Stuart had to serve as the door guard, which I'm sure sucked for him, but it worked out okay. This is about 110 days into the playthrough. As I said earlier, it's much less cave and more like a sanctum now, but it's still got a long way to go. I know a lot of YouTubers like to do the 100 days of a colony in Rimworld and close it out there, but for me that's just far too early. I couldn't stop playing this colony here even if I wanted to. My body just simply wouldn't have allowed me to step away. This does however mean I'd best not spend too long on minor events, so as I often like to do, let's breeze through some stuff. A mech cluster landed nearby that lowered the area's temperature by 10 degrees, which isn't ideal, but we're self-sufficient in this cave, so I left it there for quite a long time. I finally built a wall and a basic funnel to murder things in, at which point I also had Sanguinius squirt his hot vampire genes all over Ralderon, putting her into a short coma before she wakes up as an edgelord vampire. I managed to take another prisoner alive and promptly removed their legs. At this point we have enough medicine production to consistently harvest hemogen packs from the prisoners, by the way, rather than just feeding on them like uncouth savages. I finally put a new lung into Comnena and then we had a flurry of raids, 4 in a row. They were mostly easily handled with the help of the turret funnel, but the last one was a bit more tricky. 2 groups of Itakin from either side of the map, one of which cut Stuart off from the base, meaning I had to send out Sanguinius and Ralderon to go help, then run them back before the other group started their attack, but as usual, it went okay, and that's all I asked for. After all that excitement, it was time for Sicko to become a child, just as toxic fallout blanketed the area. Childhood in Rimworld is dotted with growth moments, between which the child will try and perform their desired learning activity, which changes frequently and ranges from drawing scribbles on the floor, learning from an adult in the classroom, to running around in the toxic fallout getting poisoned and losing toes to frostbite. Doing these things fills their need for learning, which increases the rate their growth tier advances. The higher a child's growth tier when a growth moment comes, the more choices of traits and passions you'll get to allocate them. A child only gets 3 growth moments in total, the last one being at age 13, after which they're considered an adult. It's worth noting, by the way, that children in Rimworld by default age at 4 times the normal rate, so it actually only takes a child 3 and a bit years to reach adulthood. So now of course we're getting to the point where transhumanists will complain about not having their shiny things like neural superchargers and all that. So whenever I get some advanced components, I'll make some new bits to stick onto the colonists. I actually even put a field hand onto Ralderon here, since at this point she's the only planter in the colony and has a whole lot of mushrooms to work on. I finally sent Sanguinius to go and deal with that climate adjuster, never actually engaging the mechs there. I just broke the adjuster and ran away, because why make things harder for myself? There was a transport pod crash from which I took a prisoner named Thorn and started to convert them with rituals. They'd pretty much be a permanent researcher once recruited. And here is where I wanted to get into the mechanoid stuff too, so I grabbed the transponder out of that thing there and called down the mechaniter's ship, killed the accompanying robots and then pulled the mech link off the desiccated skeleton, immediately screwing it into Sanguinius's skull, making him a psychic mechanoid controlling vampire. I ended a session here, and the first thing that happened when I started playing the next day was that Sanguinius and Comnena divorced, which wasn't exactly how I pictured this going in my head, but whatever, fine. Comnena kept the big shiny bedroom, and Sanguinius got relegated to what actually used to be a prison cell before I made the prisoners more appropriate lodgings. The space alongside those new prison cells is for some Mechaniter stuff. Early on, I'll just have a few constructors and lifters. I don't really find the early combat bots to be particularly useful, but I've still made a few to follow Sanguinius around and soak up a couple of bullets. Another transport pod prisoner dropped, Zin. She's very good if you can ignore her extremely advanced age, which I can for now, so I captured her for recruiting. And there were a few more raids between these events. A small mech raid which was slightly harder because Sanguinius was busy napping, but still pretty easy to deal with. And that was immediately followed by a large gang of Wookiees, which informed me I should probably build sturdier defences. Because while it actually didn't even result in much injury, it was an absolute shit show. And I remembered at this point that mechanoids do have a downside. When charging, they produce waste packs, which need to be kept frozen to prevent them from spreading pollution. So I started work converting a section of the strip mine with access to an air vent in the roof into a very large freezer. I wasn't sure how efficient this would actually be, but given how cold the region is already, it was completely fine. For a good portion of the year, I don't even need to actively cool it. We've passed over 200 days into the colony here, and I've researched advanced fabrication so that a lot more bionics can start to be made. I replaced both of Stuart's lungs, for example, to cure his asthma. I was also by this point getting seriously fed up with solar power, so I started to build tunnels out to steam geysers for geothermal power. But I wasn't the only one tunneling. A breaching mech hive raid came for me right as I'd planned these constructions. Having to go out and face them in the field was a touch rough, but could have gone much worse. Sanguinius got to just jump between mechs, one or two shotting them with his big shiny hammer, while the other guys stood among the corpses of the past raiders, taking a few hits, but nothing life-threatening. A gang of Imperials set up a siege just afterwards, which should probably have been a tough challenge, but Sanguinius and Ralderon made hilariously quick work of them. So long as they don't get set on fire, they really are quite overpowered. Just after that, young Sicko had her first growth moment. I got to choose 3 skills to put a level of passion into, and a trait. She got Quick Sleeper because that goes very well with both transhumanists and sanguiphages, which, by the way, don't sleep much, aside from when they go into a 3-day-long nap, that is. So what are the goals at this point? The base already looks cool, it's got big evil vampire vibes, so I pretty much consider that part fulfilled. Any other work on it is just to facilitate the other stuff. I basically want to make sure Lil Sicko is raised good and proper, make some more of the colonists into vampirophages, and get into some of the more advanced Mechaniter stuff. So with that in mind, I had Sanguinius call in the first of the mechanoid threats, the Diabolus. Which, with Ralderon and Sanguinius as strong as they already are, is not a real threat. It drops a signal chip, which a Mechaniter can then study to unlock the next level of mech tech. You can also use the signal chips to make some neat Mechaniter stuff though, like this mech commander helmet that Eustace made as a masterwork for Sanguinius. It was now that Ralderon did her best impression of a got milk ad all over Stuart's face and put him into that special vampire coma to give him superpowers. But anyway, about that next load of mech stuff. Firstly, in order to make the larger mechanoids, I'd need larger Mechaniter buildings. And since I had way too much fungus growing at this point, I decided to convert the original fungus farm into a large mechanoid incubation and charging room. Secondly, to produce the subcores that go into the more advanced mechanoids, I had to painfully scan people's brains. For some reason I didn't realise immediately that I could just use the meat nuggets for this and sent the colony's least useful member in for a brain scan instead, Zin. It doesn't do any permanent damage, but they don't exactly love it either. We did have another infestation here, but these really aren't worth talking about much when you have 3 near unkillable melee combat masters. You just go stand in the doorway and kill the bugs. Now I can't help but think that all of the extra factions added in biotech are watering down the pool of factions with too many tribal or melee focused people, which I'm sure can either be fixed with mods or just ridiculous levels of threat scaling, but it would have been nice to have a couple of more advanced factions mixed in with the rest. A society of hussars chugging go juice with charge rifles would have been pretty terrifying. And I'm sure I'll see some really fucked up stuff coming at me the more I play biotech, especially with mods, but that was my observation whilst playing this first colony. Back to what we were doing, which was apparently summoning another Diabolus threat, since you need more signal chips for other Mechaniter gear. And each time you summon the threat, it's a little worse. So the second time around it brought more friends, and then after that it has a shield as well as even more friends. I did this to make a bandwidth pack for Sanguinius, but then I realised it would have to replace his shield belt. which is probably much more valuable than extra mechanoids, to be honest. This would make more sense if he weren't such a strong melee combatant, of course, but oh well. On that note, I finally start to make some proper armour for the vampires. Marine armour mainly, of course there were various bits occasionally coming in from traders too though, like Raldoron's cool green recon helmet. And I could tell I was hitting the late game here, because I started to run out of steel. There were still a couple of chunks scattered around the map if I wanted to spend the time hauling them, but the immediate and convenient area had already been mined almost completely dry. My solution was just to start focusing on the ground scanning radar instead, to hopefully get some nice deposits of everything nearby. Sicko got to age 10 here, which is the second growth moment, and picked up a passion in melee as well as the brawler trait, because let's face it, we're making her a vampire, so she might as well get ready for it. And oh look, here comes Sanguinius now. She sort of had to become a sanguiphage. At some point she wandered into one of the traps and managed to pick up a scar on her brain that was limiting consciousness to around 50%. Another benefit of the sanguiphage xenotype is that any permanent injuries will heal over time, so long as the body part still exists. Okay, so we called in the second mechanoid boss, the War Queen, which certainly wasn't easy. It repeatedly spawns these little BB-8 looking things with guns. It left both Sanguinius and Raldoron in need of some of Stuart's hot wrist juice, because yeah, of course, sanguiphages can also quickly tend somebody's wounds with their special glands. So anyway, the Queen went down and gave up her power focus chip, which, as you might imagine, allows you to research the next level of mech tech, unlocking the subcore RIP scanner, because naturally, more complex mechanoids require more complex brains, so to get high subcores, you're gonna need to sacrifice some brains. I built this neat little robo-sacrifice chamber just in time for a group of 3 refugees to arrive. I quickly removed all of their legs and let them stew for a while, before finally turning them into subcores, which, if I wanted to, I could use to make my very own Diabolus. But, you know, at this point we're just about reaching 300 days since landing, and Sicko is all grown up, picking up psychic hypersensitivity as her final trait, and getting this sick samurai helmet, so it's probably about time to close this out. The base is by far the coolest I've made in Rimworld, and everyone in it is happy. The amount of joy I get from being able to have a very coherent colour scheme like this is something I hope you all share, because I look forward to making some really cool stuff in the future. I've still got a lot to explore in biotech. I've been making some of my own xenotypes for streams. Link to that below, of course. And I still need to fully explore the Mechanitor stuff, but I didn't want to go all the way with that here because, to be honest, Sanguinius just doesn't make a very good one. He's a vampire, not a nerd. The footage in the background while I close this off is of the 4 vampires really ruining the days of some besiegers that came along, by the way. So whatever you do, remain indoors. I heard something about there being cloud people out there inhabiting people's minds, but maybe that was nothing. Maybe you should go outdoors. Until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye. Hello again. I've been playing some more biotech, but since finishing up with Sanguinius and friends, I've installed a few mods. Okay, a lot of mods. I've gone back to something close to my mod list from before biotech, which means every vanilla expanded mod that's been updated, combat extended, and a few other things. For the colony we'll be talking about today, I installed an interesting mod that allows me to clone a colonist, copying their genes exactly into an embryo that can then be grown into a vat. The mod comes with a scenario that starts you off with a single colonist and the required technology and materials to start some cloning. So naturally we'll be playing that. I set the storyteller to Cass on Blood and Dust, which should give a nice balance of difficulty while still actually letting me progress when starting with a single colonist. So I created an ideology that I think will fit the colony well, the genetic union. Their gestalt, which means they sort of share a mood. If the majority of the colony is happy, then they get a mood buff and vice versa. Alongside that, they're traders and fleshcrafters, which I had hoped would go together better, but unfortunately it turns out no one will buy fleshcrafted body parts. Still, the trader precept is a very handy one, allowing you to have a constant flow of caravans to the colony, which help with both commerce and defense. We're settling on a southern coastline, just west of Horse's Achievement C, in an area of flat terrain. I've been making too many mountain colonies of late, so I think it'll be nice to play on some flatter ground for a change. As for our single colonist, well, that would be Greg. I created a xenotype for him named Clone Origin, which grants elongated fingers, pretty, reduced pain, and sanguine, for the drawbacks of cold weakness, tinder skin, and being sterile, which, to be fair, is kind of a free one since, cloning. Greg himself is a 10 across the board, with passions in shooting, construction, cooking, and medical. I actually thought that when I cloned Greg, his progeny would inherit these skills, but I was wrong about that. So this isn't as OP a colony as I thought it was going to be back when I created the progenitor Greg. So I know I've said this a lot lately, but this one really will have a slow start, since Greg is all alone and will have to wait for his clones to grow. But first things first, I built a small wooden shack for all of this to take place in. I'd need to get some good steady power generation as soon as possible to support growth vats, so since we've got a river here, I started researching water mills. For now though, a wood fueled generator would do. With the place powered up, I extracted Greg's gene seed and threw it into a growth vat, at which point I learned the story of the hungry homunculus. It turns out that massively accelerating human growth requires quite a lot of nutrition, so I planted some farms and settled in for a lot of cooking. When the first embryo was born, I named it Greg II, and I also got to name the settlement, which I called the Vat Fields, and the faction Genogenesis. I finished researching watermills around this point too, so I could move on from the simple wood-fired generator. Also around this point, I ticked over 5,000 subscribers on the channel. Wow. I can't thank you all. That sounded very sarcastic, but I'm serious. I can't thank you all enough for the support. It's extremely motivating to see the numbers get bigger like that, and all of your comments have been very kind. And if you're not subscribed, well, I'm not angry, I'm just disappointed. Your mother and I expected more from you. Anyway, the first hostile event was a pack of manhunting foxes, which Greg fought off most valiantly. And to celebrate his victory, he got back into the gene extractor and had his seed collected once more. It takes a long time to incubate someone to adulthood, so having a couple on the go simultaneously seems like a good idea. Of course, it would mean I'd need to make even more food though. And I realised here that growing pawns all the way to adulthood in a growth vat is a really good way to create some absolutely awful colonists with no passions, very few skill levels, and no choice of traits, just one randomly gained at each growth moment. But I decided that it's not really in the spirit of a cloning facility to have children running around, and committed to growing every iteration of Greg all the way to adulthood in the growth vats. For quite a while here, the game was simply managing Greg every day to try and keep a steady output of meals for the vats, which at this point meant a mix of hunting and growing. And Greg wasn't particularly happy with this arrangement, and it meant that no research was getting done, which is a bigger deal than it sounds like thanks to Combat Extended. In order to produce any ammo, I needed to at least research through to machining to make a loading bench, but I couldn't really address that now, so let's just get Greg a little bit happier instead. I built a very small and basic temple and gave progenitor Greg the role of manager of total unity, which is the moral guide. And just in time for Greg II to grow to adulthood. Through his vat-bound childhood, he picked up Night Owl, Teetotaler, and Groundbreaker, which is a pretty good one. However, not as good as it would usually be, because it turns out that when a colonist gains a trait that confers skill bonuses in this way, they don't actually get them. So instead, in this case, Groundbreaker just gives the percent boosts to construction and mining ability, instead of the +4 skill levels it would also usually grant. But at least it's not a negative trait. Before I could get Greg II armed, a group of tribals from Wessard came to break some stuff. For some reason, they were much more interested in setting fires and smashing the place up than killing Gregs, which meant that I could just about fight them off. Cutting forwards a bit, we've built the base out somewhat, giving Greg II his own bedroom and making space for a little workshop later on. Then, after granting Greg II the role of fleshcrafter, we beat a pig who crashed in a drop pod to death and stole some of his body parts before fighting off another raid. Now it's about time that progenitor Greg gets his own room, and now's when some stuff starts to go into the workshop area too. And Greg III becomes an adult and gains the tough trait, earning him his place as the colony's first melee fighter. And so that Greg can spend more time putting his comparatively high skills to work, Greg III will spend the vast majority of his time sat in front of the research bench. A slow process at first, but as I'm sure you know, Intellectual is by far the fastest skill to level in Rimworld, and before you know it, a brainless clone will grow to be a savant-level researcher. And here's another Greg, the fourth this time. I hope you're recognizing the naming pattern by now. It's pretty complex, I know. The cloning mod features random mutations, which are configurable in the mod options, and I've just left them at the default settings. But poor Greg IV has picked up nearsightedness and a case of cell instability. So while Greg III is a melee fighter because he's tough, Greg IV is a melee fighter because he can't see the distance so good. It's different paths to the same end result. Something journey destination, I don't know. The Gregs had an unforgettable party and then beat another space refugee down to their component parts. And then in a moment of extreme good fortune, I was just looking at these cool weapons that I couldn't afford from a war merchant, when a pair of man-hunting polar bears wandered in and bashed in the skull of one of the caravan's muffalo, spilling the shiny futuristic swords onto the ground. The merchants decided this wasn't worth the trouble and just left without them. So thanks, polar bears, you won't be forgotten. Okay, so I dramatised the events a little bit. The bears didn't actually bash in the muffalo's skull. They just injured it enough that when I looked away, it fell over. Along with the swords, it also dropped 31 of these 155mm EMP shells, which turned out to be worth about 12,000 silver in total. This is a top-shelf Rimworld moment, to be brought down for special occasions and good company. A completely negative event netting the colony a pair of top-tier weapons and 12,000 silver. Now it's time to make a nicer dining and recreation room, because the place is a little bit utilitarian right now. Having the trader ideology raises everyone's expectation levels, and then bestowing them roles raises them even further, which is pretty rough early game, since it means to stave off boredom they need 6 different types of recreation available. And with that in mind, I researched modern furniture so that they could have a standing piano, and I also bought a sick flat screen. Another more useful feature of the traders is that they can perform a ritual to attract caravans to the colony, so we did that. It wasn't great and only attracted a single caravan, which someone holding the trader role can do just about every day anyway, but whatever. The reason I'm bringing it up is because it attracted a slaver who had some worrying merchandise. They're selling an Itakin child who belongs to an ideology named Furry Pack, which has an icon of Tzeentch for its symbol. And that's pretty rough, but to be fair, it could be worse. It could be Slaanesh. Then another child showed up, as a wanderer this time, asking nicely if they could join the colony. They're named Grumps, which is almost Greg, sort of, but not close enough, so they were sent away. At this point I decided we had survived off the back of luck for long enough and made some turrets. These military turrets with 2 guns are crazy powerful in combat extended, as I discovered in my Winston Wave video, so I made 2 little emplacements of those for now. Real defences would have to come later. We don't really have the workforce to put up proper walls and everything for now. Another slaver came by, in space this time, and I decided to buy this nice young lady called Lou, for her cooking ability. Nothing else. I know, funny sex slave joke, but seriously, with her cooking and helping out in the fields, that freed up a lot more time for Greg to do other things that the clones couldn't do so good, like crafting. And Greg IV, in all his instability, managed to reach adulthood, gaining eccentric, ecologist, and desensitized along the way, which are all pretty good, but just to reiterate, the skill bonuses from ecologist aren't applied here, only the percentage buffs. And I'd like to know what he saw in his growth vat dreams of being a weirdo ecologist that desensitized him to everything, but we'll never know. He was sleeping on the floor for a moment here, so I quickly built another bedroom for him, mirroring the shape of Greg III's room here, which is a strange looking room, but in architecture, just like jazz, repetition legitimizes, repetition legitimizes, repetition legitimizes. And then something a little bit weird happened. Something that's bound to happen occasionally when you have equipment mods going. A trader spawned and I spent a while looking for the actual trader person, only to find them incapacitated over where they had spawned. The cause is their gas mask, which I think is from Vanilla Apparel Expanded. It provides protection from, well, things you'd wear a gas mask for, with the drawback of reducing the colonists' breathing efficiency. Fair enough. Breathing through heavy-duty respirators sucks. The end result is that this poor old lady with basically every old person debuff in the game spawned with a gas mask on, and it pushed her consciousness low enough to make her vegetative. So anyway, there she is on the floor, not allowing me to trade with them, so I figured I'd help out and rescue her. The problem is that to ever get rid of her again, I have to strip her to get rid of the mask, which angers the faction. But now I can trade with them, and there's nothing here for me, but at least I get some of the goodwill back when they leave. And oh boy, look at this, there's drop pods everywhere. Another great opportunity to demonstrate the extreme power of shotguns in Combat Extended. And with the little help from the turrets, they were dealt with pretty easily. I keep having to turn wanderers away to preserve the gregginess of the colony. It really hurts when I have all of these useless Gregs that I could be turning away incredible colonists, but the simple fact of the matter is they're not Greg, so they can't join. Alrighty, a couple more fighty things happened here. Firstly, there'd been this worm hanging around the colony for a while and I hadn't seen it eat anything, so I decided it was smart to kill it before it ate someone. Then, in some kind of reptilian brotherhood revenge plot, an absolute horde of blind salamanders, ohms I guess, descended upon us. They're small and squishy, so it looked a lot worse than it was. But that was followed shortly by a tribal raid, which are also quite squishy, so still no big deal. I had a quest come in for a neuroformer. All I had to do was deal with a climate adjuster. And I wanted to make Progenitor Greg a psychic, so I sent him and Greg II to go deal with it. Which wasn't hard, aside from this single turret that was there. Greg got the Warlord tree as his first, which is great, but I feel like with Vanilla Psycasts expanded, in order to level a Psycaster quickly, it's best to have something like this skill in the Technomancer tree, which allows you to increase the quality of an item by 1 level. I like this because it's completely spammable. The reason it's important to me is that in Vanilla Psycasts expanded, your casters level by meditating to gain psi juice, so you want to be able to constantly spend their psi juice to race through the first few levels nice and quick. However, at this point things started to go a little bit not so well. I could just feel that the colony was lagging behind the level of threats that were now being thrown at it. But we kept plugging along, fending off the inhabitants of an infested chunk and then a raid of armoured kingdom folk. I accepted a small construction quest since it rewarded a pair of tech prints, one of which was for brain wiring, which would be pretty essential for pain stoppers, as flesh crafting comes with the scarification precept for some reason, which is a real, well, pain without pain stoppers. I finally started to plan a big outer wall here, but if I'm being honest, this isn't really quite how you do it with this many mods. If you look at the threats that come upon the colony from here, you'll notice that not many of them spawn from the map edges, but that doesn't really matter because the wall isn't built anyway. Just planned. A couple of things happened here that weren't recorded, because it turns out that if you open Netflix whilst recording with Shadowplay, it will just stop your recording without a notification. I just wanted to check whether All Quiet on the Western Front was out yet. I didn't even watch it. What you missed was Progenitor Greg starting to write skill books for his progeny so that they could start to be less useless. And Greg V growing to adulthood with the traits Trigger Happy, Academian and Dog Person. Also, he annoyingly picked up Lou's Angler ideologies, so I just kept throwing him back in the growth vat between convert cooldowns until all that was sorted. And there was a pretty cool Toxfolk drop pod raid that had us all fighting in the hallways. It was great, and then I realised it wasn't recorded and that made me sad, so I stopped for the day. The next morning, things started to go from bad to very bad. For some reason, the place started to get very sickly all of a sudden. A few of the Gregs were hit with plague, which got really close to killing Greg V for some reason. Probably didn't help that we weren't actually manufacturing medicine yet, but there was a decent supply of Glitterworld meds. I'm always kind of stingy with those though, so they weren't being used. A pack of manhunting wargs came and had a go at the turrets, but they were dealt with quite nicely. Most soft targets can be dealt with pretty easily by the turrets in Combat Extended. Sieges aren't quite so simple though. A gang of pigs showed up and had to be drawn from their cover by Greg V with his makeshift LMG, which took a really long time, but we got them to come attack eventually and just about dealt with them. And then a few more infested chunks landed. I tend to dread these particular events as their brutality is so varied. This time it went pretty okay, and to be fair, the reward is a good chunk of steel and components, so that's fine, I guess. I had set up a hydroponics room at this point and put it to work producing cotton and dyes. Clearly I've got my priorities straight here. I should really be focusing on defences and the colony's medical capabilities, but oh well. At least I can start to paint the walls a nice shade of Viridian. Greg had gained a few Psylink levels by this point and had just unlocked the ability to create steel constructs, which are essentially just animated slag chunks to stand in front of enemies for you. They're pretty mediocre and a bit of a pain to manage when compared to the new Mechaniter stuff. They don't have their own fancy UI and just have to be drafted whenever you need them, rather than being able to escort their creator at all times. Anyway, an infested ship module crashed here. which, as you might expect, is much the same concept as the infested chunks, but bigger bugs come out. I got pretty worried when I saw this big girl and her megapede pop out, but it was actually fine. Again, military turrets are real good, lots of bullets. A couple of larger targets aren't the problem. It's when there's a horde of unsuppressible targets that these turrets get overwhelmed. Ominous foreshadowing. I mentioned that the place got very ill all of a sudden today, and here's some more of that. First came the malaria, then the flu, and then the alpacas, which aren't a disease, but still, alpacas. I figured it was best to have a party to cheer everybody up. Given that there's malaria, plague, and the flu running rampant, this probably isn't technically the best idea, but Rimworld isn't actually modelling super spreader events, so it's probably fine. And Lou decided now was a good time to make a run for it, so Greg III cut off her arm. It's always kind of a neat idea to have blunt weapons on hand for this kind of scenario, but in the heat of the moment, you know how it is. You just start chopping and hope for the best. It would have been nice to attach one of the flesh-crafted arms I had here, but for some reason that wasn't an option. I only seemed to be able to replace an existing part with a flesh-crafted one, rather than put one into a void left by the original, if that makes sense. I'm not sure if that's the intended behaviour, but it doesn't seem like it. I never once actually made use of the flesh-crafting precept of this ideology, other than for funny war crime content anyway. Like when this transport pod crashed and I rescued the inhabitants since they were actually from a local faction. But then I accidentally let them starve to death, and then harvested them for parts that I would never use. Anyway, half of that exterior wall that I planned earlier is built now, which is cool, but a limestone wall can't stop malaria, which made its second appearance right about now. Poor Greg IV has managed to catch every single one of these illnesses, by the way, and for his hardship he gained the super immune trait, which is the only time I've ever had one of these events that feels reasonable. The guy is just a walking biological weapon by now. And this is the perfect time for a fairly large bandit raid. I was really feeling like I was behind the difficulty curve at this point. Just not getting enough done in terms of research, arms and armour production, or population. But we managed to hold off those rootin' tootin' fellers just in time for Greg VI to come out of her vat. Yeah, her. I'm not sure how that happened, but Greg VI is a lady. Fair enough. It makes no difference to me. She's got the traits Industrious, Wimp, and Mad Surgeon. Mad Surgeon and Industrious are pretty great, though training medical from zero is a pretty Herculean task that involves a lot of organ harvesting, and probably a book by Progenitor Greg. And it feels like at this point the downward spiral sort of just drops away and is replaced by a freefall. A massive pack of Manhunter Wolfhounds show up. And remember when I was talking about how great these military turrets are, except for against hordes of things? Well, sure enough, the two turrets were no match for the Bloodhound gang, and I put up a sort of half-hearted defense, which actually did much better than I thought, but it didn't go too well for Greg II, who effectively got his head bitten off. The message in the log actually reads, "Missing a neck caused Greg II to die," which I can't fault for accuracy, but it's not a particularly sympathetic way of putting it. So the Gregs made him a sarcophagus of jade and had a funeral for him. Greg II was the colony's premier miner and builder, having long since overtaken Progenitor Greg in both aspects, so losing him was really going to suck, but isn't necessarily a death sentence for the colony. However, it didn't help things when a little while later, shortly after fitting a prosthetic arm to her, Lou decided to try and run away again. This time, Greg IV decided to just behead her. She's not gonna run away again, so I guess from a certain perspective it makes sense. But now that leaves us without a full-time cook. And sure, OG Greg can slot back into that role, but then who's gonna build? You can tell by now that things are slipping away from me, going from bad to worse. And in something of a portentous vision of the future, a gang of poor orphans were savaged to death by another hungry worm. I'm not sure why there's so many of those hanging around here, but they're properly deadly. And oh look, here's the coffin nail flying in from space, in the form of yet more infested chunks. They landed and immediately the bugs spilled out and started to attack. I think because they landed on a section of wall, but I'm not totally sure. In any case, I wasn't prepared at all, and they quickly got into stabbing range and murdered everybody but Greg IV, who could now do nothing but destroy the evidence that this whole thing ever even happened. It's probably best if the world at large forgets of the Greg experiment, allowing them to fade into obscurity as a myth. a cautionary tale against trying to run a colony on entirely vat-grown colonists. In his final moments, he stands at the piano and plays a short tune before finally giving in to smoke inhalation. So there it is. Biotech is still very good fun, but I really can't recommend you try a colony like this. Growth vats are seriously underpowered in their current state, and I'd love it if there were some archotech improvements for them, allowing vat-grown colonists to either develop properly or much more quickly. And I'm sure this is something I'll be able to retry with mods once they've had a little longer to melt properly into the biotech stew, as currently for the most part they just feel compatible rather than properly tuned. I hope you enjoyed watching a failed colony for a change too. It's important to remember that it's not all roaring successes. For every colony you see, there's usually at least one heartbreaker that made it just far enough to have me really invested before falling apart. Whatever you do though, please remain indoors. There's a suspiciously high number of worms out there. No, not worms. Worms. With wings. Teeth. Until next time, thanks for watching. Goodbye. Hello again. Today we're finally doing it. The moment you've all been waiting for is here. I'm doing a solo ice sheet run. Losing is fun, the whole nine. But I'm going to be doing it a little bit differently. Instead of spawning on the ice sheet as a sniveling weak human, I'll be crafting the perfect being, specifically designed to withstand the brutal cold of the ice sheet. So meet David Bishop, the optimistic, jogging ice blob. He's resistant to frostbite, psychically deaf, cold tolerant, moves faster when he's cold, deals more melee damage, is rowdy and will resist arrest whilst shooting ropes of not particularly motile sperm from an elevated position thanks to his gas bags. He's also got a fluffy tail and his body is covered in fur, unlike his head, which is a gaseous hood. He's also got genetically poor cooking, social and artistic skills, whilst being gifted in melee combat. So yeah, he's a pretty complex dude. And he arrives in his new home at the very southern pole of the planet, where the average temperature is negative 53 degrees Celsius. That's so cold that if you shook it too hard after a piss, the damn thing might just snap off. He follows a quite simple ideology called ice cubism, the core tenets of which are transhumanism and cannibalism. Because on the ice sheet, people paste is the way to do it. But that's a long way off. Right now we have nothing, so we'll deconstruct some ancient monuments for stone blocks, with which we'll build a room around a geothermal vent. The classic ice sheet starter base. It gets hot enough in here that Bishop's got to sleep his first night with the door open, cozy in his bed, surrounded by superheated gas pumped up from the depths of the earth. So, if step 1 is to make a warm place to sleep, step 2 is to make a knife for stabbing things with. Things like this bunny, who's taking a real interest in the warm room. Unsurprisingly, with his increased melee damage and decent skill, the snow hare never stood a chance. There's another hare on the map, but after that, we've got nothing to eat until something or someone else shows up. Until that happens, I'm having Bishop hastily mine as much steel as he needs to make a paste dispenser with. Speaking of paste, look who's here. Callie Wall, once a paramedic, now Bishop's first victim. She drops some quite nice stuff, but of course we're in it for the food, really. This does make her faction, or wearer, hostile. Ordinarily not ideal, but since our only real source of food for a good while is raiders, the more hostile factions the better. Unfortunately, nothing we can kill is going to be butchered very efficiently for a very long time, because no matter what primary material you make a butcher table from, you need a little wood, and there ain't no trees down here on the South Pole. It's pretty important to keep Bishop happy because when it gets real cold, his furry tail won't save him from hypothermia, which will turn a fairly innocuous mental break like a sad wander into a death sentence. So he made a horseshoe pin, and then he built a windmill, because we've got to power up the paste machine that'll come soon, and also because lighting up the place will help with basically everything. Now, Callie, who we just stabbed to death a moment ago, brought a revolver with her, and a group of megasloths has just wandered onto the map. I mean, you've gotta try, right? And while it takes some substantial doing, at the end of the day we move faster than them and have a gun, so eventually one goes down. And since that went so well, why not another? So with 2 Megasloths sloppily butchered in the designated corner of the room, that'll feed Bishop for a while, and we can probably find a use for the wool as well. A Lynx, having seen this, decided that today was its day to die and went for Bishop. Followed by a single waster named Hopkins, who brought a revolver with him. Bishop waits for him around the paste dispenser and drops him in one shot. Huh. Ah yes, it turns out he's a delicate genie, so his pain threshold is basically non-existent. Yeah, that'll do it. Momentarily I was tempted to take him in and work on recruiting, but we're not really ready for that, and also he'd probably just stub his toe and die of pain shock anyway. Next up, a pair of completely ordinary folk from the compact of Alus are passing by, and Bishop starts salivating and floats on over, holding his knife in a white-knuckle grip. And sure, one by one he cut them to death, but not without injury. Sammy managed to snap off one of his fingers, and then Paul followed up with a toe. So that's not ideal, but at least Paul dropped some handy bits. Oh, and I also didn't realise there was another, Sparkles, who, unarmed and actively fleeing, gets gunned down. Now, after patching up the holes left behind by Bishop's newly departed extremities, it's probably time to make this freezing cold hovel into a freezing cold home. With a research table and a regular table in the freshly built annex, we can start working towards batteries, since until we have geothermal power, those will be quite important. For now though, with the freezer, which is actually just any room, full of meat, Bishop's getting lit on some smoke leaf he robbed from a corpse. Of course, he's also robbed quite a few items of clothing by this point, enough to let him withstand negative 73 degrees Celsius, which is very cold, but it will actually get colder than that here sometimes. Right now it's only about negative 30. Anyway, progressing through research in the relative warmth of the base is nice, but we will need some materials sooner or later. So when a quest that rewards some plasteel for fighting off 2 raids comes in, I'm willing to give it a go. But before those raiders arrive, a single slug person shows up. They have a knife, Bishop has a gun. You know the drill. They're put down alive, meaning that we have the chance to steal some untainted clothes for a change, including this hat, which I'm not entirely sure how Bishop is wearing, and then the Tox folk that we were expecting show up shortly afterwards. It's a pair of genies both carrying Tox grenades, a hilariously ineffective combination. The second wave is considerably scarier. 2 wasters, one with a shotgun. Thankfully it's still relatively easy to deal with because Bishop outranges him with his pistol. I would consider capturing some of these raiders by the way, but as wasters their psychite dependency makes them pretty much impossible right now. So we continue our Lonely Polar experience. There's plenty more opportunities coming our way though, like Crispo here, a pretty standard dude. I'd capture this guy, I really would, but of course Bishop shot him dead, so too bad. Never mind though, Cass has someone else for us. A wanderer named Holster wants to join. I can't see exactly what their stats look like, but they are a nurse, so they're likely to have half-decent medical skill at the very least. It turns out they're a nimble psychopath who's incapable of violence, which feels like an odd combination, but whatever, fair enough. I'm just happy to have a second pair of hands around the base. And it really will just be around the base for the most part, because it's way too cold for them to do anything outdoors. Negative 52 degrees C. Even wrapped up in the warmest clothes we have, they're pretty much confined to indoors. But with a second person hanging around, we now have to name the place. So I called the faction Hard Nipple Society and the settlement Polar Nipple. Something was very clearly going through my mind here. Anyway, we've researched batteries, so we'll move on to researching geothermal power, build some batteries, and then start putting some heating into the base, since we've got a fragile, shivering human on board now. And about that human. They're a victoryist, the planet's basic supremacist ideology. In other words, they're not okay with eating paste, or people paste, for that matter. For now I'll just put up with this because it will be nice to have a second researcher to blast through some stuff, but eventually we're going to have to do something about that. Not now though, because Bean is here.
The name's Bean.
And he's going for our freshly built batteries, a crime for which he is shot and fed into the paste dispenser. On the ice sheet, events can be pretty one note at this point in the game. Later on there's more variety, but right now it's largely just raiders getting put down and eaten, and the occasional transport pod. Like this one, with an incredibly useless Wookiee in it, literally capable of almost nothing. Generally having an Itakin colonist would be handy, what with the warm fur, but it's pretty rare for the correct set of traits to align for an acceptable colonist here, and this guy really emphatically is not it. To break up the string of friendly or incapacitated visitors to the map, next we have, almost simultaneously, a meteor full of components and a solar flare. Lovely. Well, if we've got no power to run the heaters, then let's make some hats real quick. For some reason you can make a tail cap out of human leather, and I don't want to know what they're using for the tail. I had said earlier on that I wasn't going to try and convert Holster just yet, but he's gotten annoyed enough to go on a food binge, which is really not ideal here in the frozen, entirely foodless wastes. So it's time to build a little prison. And it's a shame to lose the extra pair of hands around the house, and it's going to take a really long time to convert them because they're a psychopath and Bishop has absolutely no social skills, and also we still have to feed him, but there's not a whole lot else to do right now. Aside from fending off more absolutely hideously unrecruitable raiders like Smelly the Pig here, who has 0 shooting and still did a better job than Bishop. Screw you, pig. Enjoy frostbite. Now, despite those 2 raids, we're not exactly sitting on a hoard of food. In fact, the freezer is kind of looking pretty much empty. Cass? More raiders, please. Ah, good. Here's Paolo the Genie. One tapped because genie, and that will keep us fed for a few more days. Sometimes quests will come in on the world map, but we can't really do that kind of stuff because everything is a few days off and we'd be leaving the home front undefended, so we just have to keep waiting for Cass to feed us. And to her credit, she does, with Kolol the Wookiee here. I built the grinder thing from the Vanilla Nutrient Paste Expanded mod because I wondered whether I could feed bodies directly into it to bypass the terrible efficiency penalty of the butcher spot. But alas, no, you cannot. So we're stuck with our awful meat yields. We're now 50 days into this colony, and it's going, well, it's going. Let's not dwell on the details too much. Let's instead take a minute to talk about today's sponsor, Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus. A turn-based tactical strategy game set in the eternal conflict of the 41st millennium that lets you enjoy fast-paced battlefield gameplay right on your phone. You can choose between over 80 legendary champions from 18 playable factions. Personally, I love a good Tyrannid. I'm working on one right now. I'll finish it eventually, I promise. Don't look in the grey drawer. Don't look in there, there's nothing in there for you. I actually really love how the game's art style is so clearly inspired by the classic tabletop painting style. I mean, look at them, they have edge highlights and everything. And with a constant flow of fresh content, including new game modes and challenging live events, there's plenty to keep you busy. And with an average 4.5 rating on the app stores, it's clearly worth checking out. So download and play Tacticus for free today, either by scanning the QR code on screen or using my link from below with code TACTIHAZOR and get yourself 50 energy and 10 Nicodemus character shards. Now, back to the ice sheet, where I'm having to seriously consider denying Holster food just to stretch out what we have for maybe another day. A poor old man suffering from Alzheimer's shows up though to feed us for another day at least, but that's really all we'll get, another day. Holster, you're starting to look kind of tasty. This brings me no joy, mainly because it means all the nutrient paste I fed you was completely wasted. But we did just finish researching hydroponics though, so maybe we have some long-term hope here after all. We'll build some basins, but without geothermal power they're not very likely to bear fruit just yet. And then it occurs to me that maybe I should have gone for solar power instead. Or maybe a second windmill will do the trick. There's a way through this starvation, I'm quite sure of it. Please, Rice, grow. Grow. Come on, grow like Bishop's life depends on it. It really does. Maybe, just maybe, if you subscribe to the channel, the rice will make it. Ah, good stuff. That's the most satisfying 4 meals worth of rice I've ever grown. I think I will pivot to solar though real quick. I think focusing on geothermal is ultimately the best idea, but it just has the potential to take too long and starve us out in the process. But another lonely Wookiee shows up and is shot dead, extending our food supply just very slightly again. Now we can sit and watch a windmill for a while. If it keeps turning, we grow rice. If it doesn't, we don't. Okay, fuck you, wind. But alright, we've researched solar now, and after quickly throwing down a few panels, that should be at least mostly stable power. Now Maker the pig drops from the sky. With a pretty decent stat line, it's worth giving a go, I think. And something I've noticed, by the way, since we're at the pole, solar panels work at just over half capacity for about half the year, because the sun never fully sets. And then once we hit winter, they barely work at all. So they're not a permanent solution, but they'll let us grow rice for now, and that's all that matters. Also, here's a polar bear, so let's gun that down. It's a convenient little boon that will push us just out of desperate sustenance living for a while and see us in a position to actually make some progress. We're harvesting more and more rice as we gently expand the hydroponics operation, but can we feed 3 mouths? I'm not sure, but this paralyzed fishman named Jerk sure is interesting, so we're going to give it a go. A quest comes in now that forces a volcanic winter for a few weeks. That doesn't really matter to us, since it has no effect on solar panels, even though it probably should, and it's so cold here that it being colder just doesn't really matter. The reward is 2 masterwork weapons, a nerve spiker and a recurve bow. Nerve spikers can be pretty decent, so Bishop will take that for now. Here's a genie with a sword to help demonstrate it. Spike him, Bishop! Good stuff. Some more uninteresting ice sheet time passes now. A Wookiee raid from a quest that took quite a bit of shooting but wasn't actually particularly dangerous, and aside from that we're just piling up nutrient paste in our slop vat. Until another quest arrives. The Empire want to store their toxic waste with us, and I hadn't considered it, but these quests are kind of free here. The waste packs will be permanently frozen and therefore never dissolve. Great. Easiest accept I've ever clicked. Oh, wait, I didn't consider the fact that I can't just leave them outdoors though, so I do have to do some work in that I have to build a shed to keep them in. The reward is just a book, by the way. It's not really worth the effort to most people, but you know how I am about Rimworld books. I just really can't help it. I even made a little bookshelf next to a human leather armchair for Bishop to read in. How very cozy. Anyway, the important point is that the waste packs are in a shed, so unless there's some freak double heat wave or something, there's no real risk of them dissolving. Randomly, as a complete aside, Bishop was nearly crushed by some spaceship chunks. I didn't really get a good view of it, but I'm sure it was close. Have you ever had somebody die by meteor or chunk? I don't really know if it can actually happen, so let me know. Another lone raider is put down and we're then rewarded with a crash pod containing Nicole. A kind genie, meaning she also has the wimp trait, which means she'll be incredibly easy to convert and recruit. Her stats are decent, she'd definitely help us push research forward, so alright, make room in the prison cell, another one's coming in. We really can't sustain all of these hungry mouths, so slowly we'll keep expanding the hydroponics operation, only to see all of our crops die in a solar flare anyway. How deeply rude. It's at this point that I actually realise I can use these basins to grow some fibre corn, meaning we do have some access to wood if I'm willing to sacrifice a little bit of food production. But it turns out we don't need to sacrifice anything, because with this timely meteor of steel, we can afford to expand the farm quite a lot. And besides, Cass has our bag, dropping 100 boomalope meat on the edge of the map for us. And we can finally be more productive now because Maker is on board. That's right, we're back to 2 colonists, nearly 100 days into the game. But never mind how long it took, it's time to do some expansion. Maker can't really go outside, and neither should you of course, remain indoors. Therefore we need more space indoors. Now by this point we've done a variety of quest types, but here's a new one. An Imperial shuttle is going to crash land here, at which point we'll help them fend off a raid. It's a simple enough job, but the VIP riding inside wasn't expecting to be exposed to the polar wastes, and therefore will quickly perish. Well, should have worn a coat. So obviously we didn't manage that quest, but this isn't exactly the worst possible outcome. We did still get the components and plasteel that the shuttle was made out of, and the Empire don't seem to mind us eating their fallen VIP either, so that's nice. I'm starting to notice now though that the power grid isn't looking quite so healthy anymore. The batteries aren't full, and I now realise that it's getting quite dark. Oh dear. It seems that we've enjoyed the bountiful sunny season and are quickly plunging into the darkness of a polar winter. We should probably rush the geothermal research along. So in the flickering light of the struggling base, Bishop desperately tries to figure it out. And before things get too dark, he's managed it. Just in time for Nicole to be recruited, meaning future research should go much faster. This also means that we have 3 ice cubists now, and we'll need to start addressing their ideologious needs or face the wrath of their frozen god. A wrath that Nicole seems eager to get acquainted with. She's upset with the situation and is wandering around sadly, outside, which ends predictably, with her on the ground suffering from frostbite, needing to be carried home by Maker. Up to this point, the room with the vent in it has been Bishop's bedroom, so that's obviously going to need emptying out for the building of a generator. But before I can get to work on that, Jerk joins, and then so do some mechanoid raiders. Oh dear. To our north, a pikeman, and a lancer to the south. It's nice of them to separate, but they're still quite dangerous individually. I think the best course of action is to send in the speedy and punchy Bishop to get involved in melee, whilst the rest of the crew support from nearby with their pistols. Which for the pikeman worked remarkably well. Didn't even really need the rest, Bishop just got the job done. And after a brief moment to warm up in the base, we'll go try a similar tactic on the lancer, which I'm sure would have worked just as well, but with its first shot, the lancer took off Bishop's right arm. Thankfully, it did then die relatively quickly, just like the pikeman, but paying an arm for a single lancer isn't a very good deal. So not ideal at all, but at least he can see his bloody stump in the harsh electric lights of the base now, as the geothermal generator is finally up and running. We now also have a fairly obvious research priority. We're going to need prosthetics. As I mentioned earlier, we also need a shrine now, which is fairly simple to build, and then also fairly simple to use to make Jerk the moral guide. Because despite his name, he's a pretty decent guy. Now I'm feeling all proud about having strong and consistent power, so naturally, here's a solar flare. I've talked before about flares being something of a non-event in Rimworld, but here they can actually starve the colony, since we're on the nutrient-paced equivalent of living paycheck to paycheck. Yeah, we ain't got no food. And now we have to wait a few days before a rice harvest is ready. Oh, hey there, Novak. Sorry, buddy, but we're going to eat you. We simply have no choice. With bellies full of Novak, we finish researching microelectronics, meaning we can start to trade with them there ships up in the sky, hopefully opening the door to a great many new and shiny things in the near future. Assuming we have a future, because starvation is setting in with the rice harvest another day or so away. And I noticed at this point that Nicole wasn't very happy and assumed it was just because of, well, you know, the general situation. But it turns out that Novak was her mother. Oops. But to be fair, even if I had noticed, we were getting really hungry, so I think we probably still would have eaten her. Thankfully then, what with the sudden influx of colonists, we're now getting much more sizable raids. Here's a gang of 6 pigfolk attacking on 2 fronts. They've brought some pretty decent guns with them too, so I don't really want to just face off with them at range. Instead, Bishop will equip a sword we nicked from someone earlier, and I'll send him in there to do some one-armed swordplay. Thanks to a combination of that and some mediocre shooting by the rest, the piggies turn their curly tails soon enough, leaving behind a nice untainted flak jacket. Very good. And that's dinner sorted for a few days, but near immediately afterwards there's a mech cluster. A bit of a weird one though. It's just a couple of turrets with no activation method. So these will just sleep on our map quite possibly forever. Okay then. Alright, anyway, it's taken us a long time to get around to replacing Bishop's arm. He's currently out there mining the steel that will make his new one, which can't be an easy job. But okay, Nicole, don't screw this up. Screw it on. Or strap it on? A prosthetic limb strap-ons? Wait, don't answer that. Forget I asked. We've also finally got around to making a comms station, so we can eventually do some trading. But there's no time to pat our backs, because the local faction of alien weirdos have arrived in large numbers. Large enough numbers that I realise I should have some kind of defences set up by now. They give us just enough time to get a mini turret and some sandbags thrown down before they start their attack. And with a combination of some absolutely terrible shooting from the gang and the turret, and a little bit of the old slicing from Bishop, eventually they run away. I sent Bishop to try and take one of the runners down, since I don't want to waste any food, only to have them turn around and just beat him to the floor. Okay, fair enough, you can leave, point taken. They say that bonds forged in the fires of combat are stronger than any other, and it seems that's true because Jerk and Nicole have immediately afterwards become lovers, which is really handy for a few reasons. One, they can share a bedroom, so we save some space. And two, they can share a bedroom, so they'll keep each other entertained. Our next bit of progress is building a high-tech research bench, so that we can work towards deep drilling and the ground-penetrating scanner, which should help to alleviate the ice sheet's resource scarcity. Another bit of progress is the installation of nutrient-paced drippers onto people's beds. If someone in a bed with a dripper falls below 25% hunger, they'll be fed automatically, which saves them some time in the morning. Very good. Alright, finally a trader is overhead. An exotic goods ship, who are more than happy to buy a load of random tat from us for some skill books. Again, I just kind of like collecting books, it's an addiction. I'm going to end up doing some weird planetary library colony soon, I think. Of course, I also bought the customary 2 advanced components from them, for later. Since we've got plenty of food, for a little while now I've had some of the basins growing cotton, and we're starting to very slowly make some progress in laying down carpets. Warm and comfy feet would be so incredibly welcome after coming in from the negative 53 degrees Celsius outdoors. Anyway, we bought those advanced components, and one of them is for this, a ground-penetrating scanner, which needs to be outdoors. Normally not a huge issue, but here that means that realistically only Bishop will be able to use it. And that's fine, but it will be a lot slower than if somebody smarter could spend any real time at it. But we do have time though. It's one of the few things you do have on the ice sheet, time. So he scans, and he scans. I built a little wall around him so he can at least sit under a roof. I think if you were to build a larger room and just left the 4 tiles for the scanner unroofed, you could technically heat this, but I'm not sure whether or not that's possible in such extreme cold. Anyway, he's got a comfy chair for now, so it's all fine. Before he can successfully scan anything, a mech cluster sets up nearby with a weather controller, forcing a foggy rain, which really doesn't matter to us at all, aside from making the video look a bit like crap for a while because the rain hurts YouTube's compression algorithm. And we also had a slave ship overhead who are happy to buy our spare weapons and some gold. I considered buying a nice marine helmet from them, but left it. Better to save the silver for now, I think. And then soon enough, Bishop hits a steel patch right next to the base. Very good, exactly what we needed. Of course, now I need some steel to make a drill, and we've exhausted the map's open supply of the stuff, so I planned some strip mining, but then I realised I can just replace some of the walls I made of steel in the early game with stone walls. I managed to get just enough to make the drill and its power cord, and Bishop can get to work drilling. But there's always something to interrupt him. This time it's Nicole and Jerk's wedding, which is fair enough, I guess. Once that's done, it's back to work, which I assumed he'd be better at. Bishop only has level 7 mining. I kind of figured it would be better by now, but never mind, this is going to be pretty slow though. Since he'll be spending so much time in there, I figured I'd wall in the drill so it can be lit up and maybe even heat it for a comfier drilling experience, which involves multi-analyzing, because now that we have near infinite steel, we need to start turning it into components. So as the world turns green thanks to a toxic fallout event, we'll build that multi-analyzer. I guess it's a good thing we built the drilling shed as well, because it keeps Bishop safe from the fallout. But not from the mechanoids. More have shown up. Some Scorchers, a Lancer, and a Pikeman. We'll face them at our base defenses, repelling the Scorchers pretty easily. It's raining, so they're not particularly dangerous. And now onto the longer ranged ones. I sent Bishop and Nicole to the Pikeman whilst the others keep the Lancer busy. And it smashed his leg off. Oh. I see. Well, we did finish them off. It just cost another limb, that's all. So we'll have to throw 4 more of our precious components down the drain to make him a new leg, and then an Imperial shuttle crashes. I figured I'd just leave them to either die in the cold or to the raiders, which they do. Constantius here drops his Persona Plasma Sword, and I assumed that, as usual, it wouldn't be of any use to me. But wait, it has the Freewielder trait, which means anyone can use it. Oh buddy, Bishop just got an upgrade. Fabrication is researched now, a fairly major milestone, but we need another advanced component for the bench, so we can't make use of that milestone just yet. While we wait for some advanced components, time to go and deal with that weather controller. I'm starting to get sick of this rain. And while Bishop's on the way there, another waste pack quest comes in. 181 this time, for a recon helmet. Tasty. But first, of course, the weather controller. As I usually do with these sites, I completely ignore the mechs, break into the building and destroy the thing before quietly running away. Good stuff. Finally, we can see the base without rain again. A defoliator lands with some mechs to defend it, but I want to handle this waste pack quest before dealing with that. So as quickly as we can manage, we'll expand the toxic shed, and then before filling it, deal with yet another shuttle crash quest. Which, weirdly, never spawned the raid that was supposed to come with it. Maybe because we had too many hostiles on the map already? I don't know, whatever. With that sorted, we'll pop Bishop's new recon helmet on and get to hauling those new waste packs. Which takes a long time. A really surprisingly long time, actually, but eventually he gets it all safely packed away, and now we can deal with those mechs at the defoliator. Right after building an autocannon, just in case we end up luring the bots home and need some extra firepower. I sent out the gang to face the bots, with Bishop tanking most of the damage in melee whilst the rest support as usual. Even making use of Jerk's Icy Vomit ability for a change, which works quite nicely. I'll never use it again, it's hard to remember these things. Anyway, the crew destroy the defoliator whilst Bishop limps home, and hey, there's the advanced component that we need for a fabrication bench. Very good. So Bishop gets that built, and from here on we're going to need industrial quantities of steel to keep the place stocked up with components. A little while later, a baseliner named Ash drops from the sky with a really very decent stat line, including burning passions in plants, medical and social. Good stuff. So we'll immediately drag her inside for conversion and recruitment. Awkwardly, I have to keep her in the geothermal room for now because everywhere else is in use, which means her prison cell is an open door arrangement, otherwise she'll cook to death, which isn't very conducive to recruitment. Another mech cluster arrives on the world map, much more annoying this time as it's a psychic droner, and it's about a 2-day journey from the base, so we'll send Bishop back out for that very shortly. In the meantime, there's a megasloth just outside the door, ready to be gunned down. And you know what? I'm gonna build a real butcher table for this. Would you look at that? Actual efficient butchery on the ice sheet. What a sight to behold. Alright, now time to go, Bishop. Go get some more mechs. While he's on the way there, something I'd been waiting a good while for appears. A bulk goods ship is overhead, and we'll buy some plasteel, a load of wood, and 2 more advanced components from them. Bishop makes it to the mech cluster, does his job and heads home, where Cass decides to immediately refund our purchase from that trader with a meteor of silver. Thanks, Cass. Now, I really would like to make Bishop complete again. Those prosthetics of his are holding him back in combat especially, so we'll start to fabricate advanced components whenever we can to spend on bionics. But that kind of fabrication takes a while, so quite a lot later we'll finally start making some. Oh, never mind, solar flare. After which, but before we can make a new arm and attach it to Bishop, the local xenofreaks drop all over the place in pods. This is a good kind of raid for a speedy, shielded melee combatant like Bishop, since the enemies tend to arrive in small groups or alone, ready to be cut down one by one. Okay, now we've made a pair of bionic arms, but we don't have the medicine to install them. But that's okay, because in the time it takes to grow some, Ash is recruited, and then with her high medical skill, we'll fit one. But we are going to have to wait for more medicine to do the other. This time, while we wait for the medicine to grow, we get a load of Arctic wolves, which also die very easily to the plasma sword and the newly improved defensive setup. But they'll die even easier after popping on Bishop's second bionic arm. He's really ascending now. I love when you start to get that 1 Giga Chad going in the colony. And since we're ascending, let's also start using sleep accelerators, since we've got plenty of food to deal with the increased appetite. Now here's a pretty scary looking mech hive raid, including 3 lancers. Yeep. I think our defences are strong enough for this, but just to be sure, I'll quickly finish off this wall to force them to approach all of the turrets at once. The Lancers arrived first, so Bishop gets to work on them. Nicole is on the floor in seconds, but it's nothing major. She just got shot in the foot and has no pain tolerance. With the Lancers down to Bishop and the Scorchers struggling to get anywhere near the defences, I'm actually very pleased with how that turned out. But I would still be wise to properly killbox this area up a bit, since out in the open Lancers outrange mini-turrets. It turns out now that all of our advancement has seen the base's power usage creep past what we're generating. So as quickly as possible we'll throw up another geothermal generator and get power stabilised just in time for yet more mechs to arrive. A breaching raid this time. Oh dear. I had Bishop run out to the termite, taking it down good and quick, but that doesn't stop the rest of the mechs from simply shooting their way in regardless. So this is a bit of a problem. I had him go for the rest of the mechs, backed up by Maker and Jerk as usual, who weren't being particularly useful, meaning that before too long he was on the floor by the hands, or rather scythes, of a scyther. When it goes for Maker and Jerk though, they can drag it to the turret's line of fire, which I probably should have just done with Bishop, but anyway, then they also have the ranged mechs to deal with. While they're engaged, I tried to slip in Nicole to rescue Bishop, and she pretty much immediately caught one from the Lancer and went down herself. Okay, this isn't going well, so Maker is wearing a smoke pack. As a last resort, I sent him in to try and blind the mechs, which seemingly did nothing, so he also went down. Jerk makes it inside as Ash nips out to pick up Bishop, whilst Nicole is dragging herself in on the floor. Poor Maker, though, isn't going to make it.